I've got Carmen Colomer on as our guest. She's the head of performance of Perth Glory. And before we start today's episode, our mission here at Prepare Like a Pro is to empower aspiring athletes and staff with practical knowledge from some of the industry's most inspiring individuals and to strengthen the AFL community. So if you're new to the show, please show support by following us on Instagram and subscribing to the podcast. We're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Our topic for today will be all about sports science. So more specifically, how training load can determine the best recovery method for athletes. So whether you're an athlete and you're looking to add some training methodology to your recovery routine to help your performance, or for all the high performance staff tuning in, make sure to stay with us throughout the whole way, as there'll be some nuggets and gems to add to your practice. But welcome, Carmen. Thanks for jumping on.
Thanks so much for having me, Jack.
And I'm sure most listeners tuning in are well aware of your work, but for those that haven't heard you do you mind giving us a background, Carmen, of everything you've achieved so far?
Sure, I'll try and keep it short. Probably back in 2013, decided to do my undergrad in sports science and sport coaching. And then in that time, I went over to Germany and did a semester there at the German Sport University, which really sparked my interest in sports science, probably more in the physiology area. And when I got back, I was lucky enough to get an internship at the Victorian Institute of Sport, where I was working closely with swimming, cycling, and track and field. Started my master's during that. Started an internship at the Rebels, where I did part of my master's research there. And then off the back of that, once I finished that, I was lucky enough to get a postgraduate scholar position in physiology at the Australian Institute of Sport, which was probably one of the best experiences I've had. Worked with some really great people and, of course, an outstanding setup there. And then, fortunately, there was a PhD advertised literally about 5 minutes down the road at the Brumbies. And that was in complex systems analysis. So looking at how tactically players position themselves around the field and accounting for constraints such as environmental constraints, the opposition, potentially playing home and away, and so on. So I was there as an embedded PhD student for 2.5 seasons, and I was working as a sports scientist there whilst doing my research. And then as I was in my 3rd season, an opportunity came up at the Broncos, and my supervisor and boss at the time encouraged me to go for it. He said, you can go part-time with your PhD, you're going to get a lot more out of, actually starting your career and working full-time and then finishing your PhD on the side. So moved to Brisbane at the start of 2020, had a great experience there. We didn't have a very successful year, and of course COVID hit, which didn't help. However, I loved my time at the Broncos. And then in my 2nd season at the Broncos, again, an opportunity came up overseas. This was at the 76ers in the NBA. So took that, which was, of course, an amazing opportunity. Did 2 seasons there as the director of sports science, which is just, it's exciting. It's the entertainment industry. It's everything you could imagine. But at the end of that, I decided I didn't want to come home for personal reasons, and mainly being my partner was back in Australia. So I came back here, and then was fortunate enough to get my current position as head of performance for the Perth Glory Football Club and the men's A-League team.
Yeah, wow, what a range of different sports and experiences all around the world. Take us back to when you were studying in Germany. What sort of caught your eye in the sports science side of things? Like, was it a sport that you saw? Or was it the applied side? Was it the science sort of research side that tickled your fancy? Take us through, I guess, for the sports scientists that are interested, or maybe perhaps doing their bachelor currently. What was something that you saw, and what were the sort of pathways that you knew at that stage as a sports scientist?
The German Sport University is quite an institution. It's apparently the hardest university to get into in Germany. So they have not only do you need to get into school on academic merit, you need to write an essay, but you also need to pass all these physical tests. So it's quite different.
Physical tests.
So a lot of this, yes. and I believe it's 19 tests in one day that you need to pass, and you can only fail 2. You can't fail the first one or the last one. So after 12 hours of doing all these physical tests, such as the 100-meter sprints, swimming, and so on, you then need to
Jesus.
do a 2 or 3 kilometer run, depending on whether you're male or female, and you can't fail that. Obviously, under a certain amount of time. So,
Yeah.
fortunately, as an exchange student, I did not need to do the physical tests. So, what you find there is just it's a breeding ground for uh, very sport and athletic oriented people. And there were also a lot of athletes that trained there. So uh, the gymnastic setup was made to accommodate athletes. So they had a silver medalist professional athlete who trained there. Um, they had quite a few other, I think, weightlifters as well that would train there. But they also had the second largest WADA IOC anti-doping lab in the world was based there. So at the time, their claim to fame was all the Sochi samples were sent there. So one of the subjects I chose was actually called anti-doping. So I would work in the lab there, basically just learning how to assess different samples for different illegal substances such as plasticides or just high levels of certain things, or trying to spot things that maybe we wouldn't have thought of before. So that was really the catalyst for my interest in that space, going
Hmm.
more on the physiology side of things. And yeah, obviously an outstanding experience overall, but that's probably the standout.
Yeah. And internships and I guess also doing a PhD embedded in elite sport. How important do you think they are for setting yourself up for a successful career in elite sport?
Super important. And I think a lot of people say that Australians, we're so good at sports science, and we somewhat pioneered sports science. Of course, in Europe as well, I think they're outstanding at sports science. And I think the US is still catching up, and that's no discredit to sports scientists there. I just think the system's different. And the advantage that we have is we do have these PhD programs, which I think are mutually beneficial for both parties, because the sport gets someone to come in who's cheap, but they also get
Mm.
research which they can apply to their practice. And then, of course, we don't have the resources and the funding in Australia that they do, say, potentially in the US. So it's not easy to just walk into a job and expect to get paid a lot. So, of course, you need to pay your dues. So, as a PhD student, you can be working full time, still get some money to live off from the government. You can be learning a hell of a lot, practically and theoretically, with the research that you're doing. And you're gaining all this experience on the way. And I think that I would say that that's why we have really, I guess, pioneered sports science in a way, but then also excelled as well. So I think it's really, really important if you want to work in sport, like truly want to work in sport, then doing a PhD in sport is probably my best advice.
Yeah. And obviously, it comes with its challenges. When you did you transfer from the Brumbies to the Broncos and maintain your PhD commitments, even though you made part time? You were still pursuing the PhD at that stage, or was it? If I got that wrong, it was complete, and that was your a part time role at Broncos, and the PhD was done.
So I went full time at Broncos, nothing to do with my PhD. My PhD, I just had to move down to part time hours, so which I'm still on
Right.
part time hours now. I
Yep.
have managed to publish 2 studies. I've just got 2 more I need to publish. So all the data's there. That was the key point, that I'd collected all my data, and I'd already had the framework for my thesis and all my studies set out. And then, yeah, in that time, I have actually managed to publish 2 studies. So, still slowly ticking away. It is obviously a lot easier when you are still full time with the PhD. And, I was fortunate enough to have a really understanding supervisor who would give me that time. So, you don't need to
Mhm.
come in today, just work on your PhD today. But no, the Broncos was completely separate to my PhD.
Right. And how have you found that juggling full time work and getting more leadership positions in your full time capacity while still pursuing your PhD?
Yeah, look, the PhD definitely moves lower down on the priority list. So it's a lot of it is just about discipline, really, just trying to get it done. when you have time. So trying to make time for that, so days off and so on. But it is challenging. There are times when the last thing I want to do on a day off, or if I've got a few hours in the afternoon, is to start getting stuck into PhD work. But the reality is that I actually enjoy the topic, and it is becoming more popular these days. So there is more research coming out. So I always enjoy reading new papers and so on. But yeah, the discipline is the key there.
Mm-hmm. And now that you've seen a few different environments, like from a practical sense, I guess, for the high performance managers listening in, or those in senior positions, like uh, how can we influence our environment, do you think, and put constraints in place to help for team-based sports and regular performance?
And do you mean from like an on-field setting, or do you mean within the organization?
We'll go with organization to start.
Okay, so the organization is probably not my area of expertise. That's probably more Shane Lahan, who you've had on the podcast before. So he's actually doing his PhD in that at the moment. Um, so whereas my research is a lot more about constraints and how that affects performance on the pitch, and
Mm-hmm.
then of course, so looking at how that shapes performance during a game, and then potentially applying that to training, and say maybe mimicking those demands, or understanding what a successful um, pattern of play looks like, and then trying to emulate that in training.
Right. Okay. So that, yeah, will you work close? Obviously, a sports science by trade. How closely would you work with like the performance analysts at the club, to and then the coaches to build those training drills out?
So it's still, when I was there, it was still a work in progress. I have done a bit with a performance analyst, I say at the Broncos, where I pulled out a lot of the data myself, but it was more
Mm-hmm.
just trying things out. There was never actually anything that came about from it. So it's still a work in progress, let's say, because every time I've gone somewhere new, it's been a completely different sport. So I can't apply any of
Of
the
course.
findings
Yeah.
I have to to that environment. I can't say, oh yeah, well look, when we get a line break, we need to do this, when I'm talking to an NBA coach. So
Yep.
yeah, probably more relevant to rugby union.
Of course. And then going back to your career journey, who have been some strong influences or mentors, if you like, that have helped sort of shape your philosophy today?
Yeah, I've thought about this, and I don't know if I've just been really lucky, or if sport just breeds good people, but I've been super lucky. Everywhere I've worked, I've just worked with some phenomenal people, and some that I still call friends to this day. But one standout who, I think every time I do a podcast, I just have to mention his name. He's been on your podcast before, but Ben Sapel. So he's still my supervisor, and he was my boss at the Brumbies. He was the head of performance at the time. And I listened to his interview with you actually, and the problem with him is just he's too humble, and he'll never brag about all the knowledge that he has, or all the research that he has, and how good he actually is. But we
Mm.
still message probably 3 or 4 times a week, and anytime I just say, hey, like what would you do in this situation, he's just got, it's just nuggets of gold every single time. So he's definitely the standout.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it was a great episode, Ben, and he seems like you said a really good person and a sharp operator. On
Very sharp.
the In terms of highlights, you've sounds like you've had a fair few with the amount of travel and different sports that you've done, and like you mentioned, NBA doesn't get more of an entertaining sport than probably the NBA. But what would be some highlights that spring front of mind that you're proud of, that you've been able to experience so far in your career?
Yeah, I think every time you're with a sport, and you're there from day one of preseason, and then you see performance evolve, you see, and whether that's from it's an element that you've directly impacted, or from an overall performance level, seeing that is always a highlight. And then, so starting from preseason and then making it to finals, and wherever you end up. I still haven't won a championship where I've been, but it's coming. So there's, I think seeing that's definitely always a highlight. So getting to um, a point where at the start of the season you had no idea where the season was going to finish up. I also think, yeah, obviously the NBA was a huge highlight. Like that's just in terms of just seeing it from the back end and seeing how much goes into the sport, how much, yes, it's the entertainment industry, but these athletes are still required to perform every second day, sometimes 5 times a week, and the amount of work that needs to go into just looking after their bodies, and then the amount of work that goes into just putting on the show, and it's crazy, and it never gets boring. So I'd say those are probably the highlights.
Yeah. Were there particular moments at an NBA game that you remember fondly that spring out, or is it a general good memory as a whole?
We had quite a few games where it was really down to the last few seconds,
Yep.
and majority of them we won. So those ones were always highlights. I think there was one where we were down maybe 1 point. Joel grabbed the ball from the other side of the court, fell on the ground. I think there was a second left on the clock, and he just single arms it all the way down the court. And the buzzer went, but it bounced and it actually almost went in, but only because he threw it so hard that it bounced out of the rim. And that would have just been the most incredible basket if he'd gotten that, and we would have won the game. But so that was
You
somewhat
see.
of a highlight. Yeah, it could have been a
Yeah.
huge highlight. But then the 2 seasons I was there, we did make it to the second round of the playoffs each time, both to Game 7. So it
Oh
would have
wow.
been nice if we'd made it at least to the Eastern Conference Final, but hopefully this year, this is their year.
Yeah. And with those three different sports at elite setting, like how does, I guess, the rugby experience going into the NBA experience help you preparing A League athletes for, for the for consistent performance, like you said, chasing that championship? What have you sort of learnt from those different codes, and how do you apply that with the current sport that you're in?
I think one thing I've really liked about seeing different environments is that you're always learning that there's not just one way to do things. And
Mhm.
the first thing you need to do, especially when you've never worked in sports before, is do a really thorough needs analysis, of course. So you need to understand, okay, well, what does this game look like? What are the physical demands? What are the physiological demands? And then also, what are the technical and tactical demands? So there's always been this period of observing and talking to people. Whenever I've started a new place, like you can't expect to walk in there and start telling them how things should be done, or just start to, you know, give them data the way you used to get data and present it the way you used to, or a previous sport. So I think it prepared me well because you become quite curious and
Mhm.
really start to look at the demands of the sport. And then also, I've developed like quite a wide range of um, different methods of doing things. So having seen rugby union, rugby league, and then the NBA, I can come to soccer and say, okay, well, as long as I've got good people around me who really understand soccer, then I can figure out somewhat the physiological demands and marry that really well with the technical and tactical demands. And then also understand that there are many ways to skin a cat. So if they have certain ways they've been doing things and that's been working for them, then I don't need to come in and change that. So understanding what the sport involves is probably number one, but then also um, capitalizing on that experience around you as well. But I think that comes from going to different sports and becoming a little more humble each time, and
Mm.
realizing that, oh gosh, I know nothing. It's like the definition of the Dunning Kruger effect. Maybe I thought I knew everything when I was at the Brumbies, and then each time I've gone to a different sport, I've gone, oh gosh, I don't know anything.
Yeah. And do you think, at some point, like what would be the experience if you went back to a code that you're familiar with at some point in your career? Do you think that effect would come in again? It's a bit of a reset phase at the start, Danny Kruger effect, and then you build into it. And you start to, once you find your needs analysis, you find your team of good people that you get your momentum up. Or do you think that you'd sort of skip that stage essentially because you know the sport? Like, is it an environment thing, or do you think it's pretty much just a new sport specific thing?
No, I think I'd definitely start again from observing and speaking to people that have been there, because reality is I was only at one club with, yes, we had staff come and go, yes, we had players come and go, but essentially the framework is the same. And, of course, I
Mm,
thought it was the best program in the world when we were there, but that's what worked for that cohort at that time. That may look
yeah.
very, very different now and still be really successful, or that may look very, very different at a different club and still be very successful. So I think it's always really important to know what's worked well there, what are the practitioner's strengths and weaknesses there, and then how can I
Mhm.
essentially fill those gaps. So I think there would definitely be an element of just observing at first and probably asking a lot of questions like, hey, do you still do this, or is this still really important, or how much time per week do you spend on this, and so on. So
Yep.
lots of questions.
Yeah, great answer. Um, and then on the flip side, during your career, what have been some significant challenges that you've faced, and how have you grown, or what have you learned from facing those challenges?
Yeah, I think from the start, like especially back when I was doing internships, there were a lot of rejections, and I think at the time it wasn't that common. So this is back in 2014.
Mm,
So maybe the pool of jobs or internships that were available was a lot smaller, and there was still quite a lot of students. Like I think in some of my lectures there'd be 300 odd students, and that's a cohort that had just started that year. So they're pumping out, let's just say, for argument's sake, 100 to 200 sports science students just at that uni every year. We're all competing for those internships to get experience because, of course, you can't get a job until you get experience. So I think at the start, I there were a few setbacks, a few rejections, not even callbacks, and I thought, well, I don't get it. Like I've had this other experience, why don't they take that into account? But of course, I was just not the person they're looking for. So what I learned from that was keep trying, persist, and don't take no for an answer. There was a time, and I told the story on the weekend, but um, I had my interview with Melbourne Rebels for my research project, and I think it was a Monday. And Bryce Kavanagh, who was the head of performance at the time, he said he was interviewing quite a few people for this research project, but he wanted to see what their skills were like. And so back then, this is pre R and Python being as big as it is now, and as useful in sports science as it is now. So Excel was the dominating software. And he said, I'm going to send everyone some data, and I'd like you to send it back to me, analyze it, and send it back to me. So I had been hammering away on YouTube, Excel tricks for sports for months, just trying to get my skills up to scratch. So I welcomed the challenge. But Friday rolled around and I still hadn't received anything from him. So I just created a fake spreadsheet, put in some dummy data, put some fake tests, and then added like typical error, smallest worthwhile change, and then showed like what the magnitude of change was, and few other little bits and pieces, and sent it to him. And I think he called me back within the hour and offered me the position on the spot. And he said, the
wow.
initiative that you took to actually do that. So I think that was a huge lesson for me, and it really took, like, I thought, okay, don't take no for an answer. Don't sit around and wait for people to come to you, because now working
Yeah,
in sport, like it's busy. It's very busy, and so don't, if you've contacted someone, you've called, emailed someone, trust me, it's not that they don't want to respond. It's just that they've got 47 other emails that are higher priority in front of them. So to Bryce's credit, he's a busy guy, but then obviously took what I did as a sign of initiative and then offered me the position.
yeah, how good. What a great story for anyone out there that's, like you mentioned, that you're going to deal with rejection early on if you're putting yourself out there for these type of big roles, because they don't come around often, and it is competitive, like you mentioned. But the importance of, I guess, it sounds like you trusted your gut and took a leap of faith, and yeah, like you said, took some initiative, and it paid off. That's great. Thank you for sharing that story, Carmen. Well, we better dive into the key topic of how training load can determine best recovery method. And maybe perhaps we'll start with just the topic itself. What does that mean to you, and break us down how you like to monitor training load at Perth Glory, and how does it influence the recovery you might prescribe the A-League players?
Well, I'll talk about training load more broadly, so not necessarily specifically to to Perth Glory, because I've done it many different ways, and I don't want to just talk about how I do it now and then maybe not everyone gets something out of it. So like training load in team sports is pretty common, and I think probably the easiest way and the most common way to track it these days is obviously GPS. So going back to what I was saying before about understanding the physical and physiological demands of your sport and doing that needs analysis, it's important to know what variables are worth tracking with that GPS. So you obviously get a myriad of variables, but which ones are going to be the most useful for you? And I mean, the good thing is you can speak to people, you can read lots of papers, there's been lots of papers published, especially when you're working in soccer, um, on what might be the variables that are worth tracking. And I mean, these days you can look at everything from absolute thresholds to relative thresholds. You can do your own analysis with the raw data and so on. So I think GPS, especially with their reliability and their validity becoming a lot better as time goes on, you can use that pretty reliably. I think sometimes people maybe forget the other elements of load. So load is obviously just duration times intensity, but essentially you're looking at like a stress on the body, right? And I think there's so many other factors in sport that have an effect on a player. So stress is stress, and players or the body doesn't necessarily see the difference. So if you look at an NBA player, for example, there's a lot of stress because a lot of stress to perform. Their load as such might not be as high as a soccer player who's just played 90 minutes versus an NBA player who's just played 36 minutes, for argument's sake. But potentially that pressure of being out there, then their accumulated sleep debt as well. So again, more stress added to the body. Then another big issue in the NBA, whatever term you'd like to use, is that they spend a lot of time on feet and a lot of time shooting. So, we found that we had players coming in on a day off, which was usually just one day in between games, that would come in and just shoot for about 4 or 5 hours in the evenings. So how do you quantify that? They may have only moved 800 meters in that time, but that's still a lot of times where they are jumping, they're shooting, they're on their feet, and they're not resting. So I think there's so many things you need to consider when it comes to training load, that isn't just from the GPS. So, and then obviously the main thing is, well, actually, how's that athlete responding to that? So, what is their internal load? So that's because you could have two athletes do exactly the same session, but for one athlete, that might be a 10 out of 10, and the other athlete, that might be a 6 out of 10. So there are so many ways to monitor internal load, and I think like the most common is probably just the RPE method. But then the key piece there is, what do you do with that data? So if you're just getting everyone's RPE for the sake of looking at an overall team average, that's fine, but that's not going to tell you what's happening at that individual level. So if everyone's rated it a 6 for that day, and then all of a sudden John Smith has rated it a 9 or a 10, and so let's just say he's a standard deviation, 2 standard deviations above the rest of the group, you can start asking questions and maybe have that conversation with him, maybe see what else is going on with a few other things that you've collected as well. But also, that's from a group level. You can also look at, well, what does John Smith usually rate? So if he usually rates it an 8 or a 9, then that's probably fine. You'd want to see eventually that come down as the player gets fitter and so on. But I think that key piece there of training load is understanding the response as well. So all the elements that add load to the athlete, and then how the athlete's actually responding to that.
Yeah, and in the different programs that you've been in, what have you seen the most effective way to measure how the athlete, like how well recovered the athlete is, or their freshness, or their readiness to perform? Is it a subjective check-in, and using your coach's eye and seeing how they are presenting, and while you're having a conversation with them, and their read on it, on how they're feeling? Is it more objective with potentially heart rate variability? Yeah, how do you like to sort of see how your athletes are responding to the training load?
Yeah, look, there's always, I think there's always like best practice, of course, but then there's your environment with your athletes. So in the NBA, for example, like unfortunately, there is no wellness, there is no heart rate variability. It's very challenging to get the players, especially when I first got there, to jump on force plates. So monitoring, say, neuromuscular fatigue, for example, using force plate metrics was also quite challenging. So in that situation, it really does become just conversations with the athlete. Uh, but there are some back ways you could do it, and okay, maybe not the best way to do it, but let's just say you're always running similar sessions, and similar to what I said with the RPE, let's just say an athlete usually accumulates 500 meters of high speed running in this certain session that you always run, but on one day suddenly they only accumulate 200 meters. I think then that can start a conversation with the athlete, and you can say, okay, what's going on? But similarly, if it's an athlete who's usually like two standard deviations above in terms of some sort of high intensity variables that you look at, because that's their positional group or so on. But again, if one day they're suddenly sitting around the group average or lower, then again you can assume fatigue, but of course always asking the athlete themselves. Um, at the moment, yes, do have the luxury of having wellness questionnaires, so that's a daily check-in, and the play obviously that's based on how honest the players are, but the players are quite good at that. So we can start to look at a few things. So how have they checked in the morning from a physio standpoint? So if we do certain checks based on hamstring strength, groin strength, and so on, and then they've also reported poor sleep, or they've also reported soreness, for example, then that's probably something we go, okay, maybe they haven't recovered well, which again, speak to the athlete, but then you can modify training based on that.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess more pre-season sort of focus being head of performance, where you're trying to expose the athletes to expose them to high chronic loads of running, if it's soccer, and high speed running and sprint, and really stretch the athletes' capacities. What would be what would influence your decision making when you're trying to reduce load? Well, we're not when you're trying to, but if you're thinking you're going to take a player out of a drill, is it the wellness metrics that you're big on, and that and then and how the athlete is feeling, and when you go and check in with them, is it more objective? Is it more just let's just see how they go and try and push them to get out there? And what's sort of your approach over preseason?
It's such a tough one to answer because I think, context is king. I think that's always the case, and there's always going to be a myriad of variables that are contributing to your decision to do that. For me,
Mm,
like I always have this performance first mindset rather than an injury risk reduction. And I know people throw that around these days, and it's become somewhat of a buzz term, but for me, consistency is the most important thing. Can we just get them out there training regularly? I and yes, of course, there's always that fine line, but oh, if we push them today, then that means they could lose a week of training and so on. But what can they do? So that they are sore. So we're looking at, say, posterior chain soreness or fatigue, and we're about to go into a speed session. It's like, okay, well, do they really need to run at 90 or 95% of their maximum velocity? Probably not worth the risk this week, especially if we looked at their previous 3 weeks and what percentage they hit in those sessions. We can make that decision to maybe say, okay, you're only actually going to hit 80% today, and you're going to finish the rest of the session. So again, there's so much context around it, but especially in preseason, like I want to see guys finish, complete 70 to 80% of preseason, which is a lot easier said than done. But you really do want them to build up that chronic load. Essentially, that's your fitness, right? So, and then it's just about manipulating those weeks, whether you're looking at low volume or intensity, for everyone to actually cope. And then also, as going back to the RPE I was talking about before, so at the start of preseason, you want to see the RPEs quite high with the training load, what it is. And then as training load increases, RPE should actually stay the same. So your session should be a lot harder, but the RPE should be the same. It's where you start to see those RPEs go through the roof that you can start asking questions. And then maybe that would contribute to the decision about pulling a player back.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you for that. And what about when you from an educational point of view with the athletes, perhaps you get the feeling that they're more just under recovered or under prepared going into that session opposed to overloaded. But how do you go about educating maybe developing players on the importance of living an elite lifestyle?
Yeah, so I think that's really important. I got really into behavioral economics about a few years ago, and I realized that a lot of what we want the athlete to do is essentially just a behavior change. So
Mhm.
I just read a whole bunch of books and looked at, okay, how can we actually change the environment to so the athlete actually doesn't even need to think. So it's all sort of set out for them. So it's how we place certain items of food at the lunch bar. It's how we set up the whole gym. It's how like the flow of it all. So I think that's really important in terms of creating that behavior change. But the education piece is also really important because we only see them for 6 to 8 hours a day, let's just say. So they've got 16 odd hours by themselves, and that's essentially where the recovery happens. We only give them say the top end of the pyramid. If you're looking at the recovery pyramid, we can only really give them that. Of course, yes, nutrition and hydration, but they're only eating 1 or 2 meals with us. But then what they go home and do, or what they put into their mouth, that's up to them. So we do have an obligation to make sure we are educating them. So when I started at Perth Glory, we in the preseason, every Wednesday we called Recovery Wednesdays, and it would always start with a presentation, which I would give based on certain things, and it would just be a very short presentations because trust me, I know players do not want to be sitting in long meetings. They don't. They've already got to do it enough with the coaches' meetings. So I didn't want to make them sit there with listening to my boring voice the whole time. So I made it engaging. I used a lot of photos of stuff they were familiar with, and I used a lot of examples of stuff that had actually happened, and showed them, hey, this is important, and this is why, and this is the effect that it has on your performance. So and that's one really big piece, but then also actually giving them the tools. So if I'm saying that, you really need to make sure your room is quiet and dark to sleep, well, sometimes they can't help that. They've got maybe a baby in the room and the blinds don't close all the way or something. So everyone got an eye mask and earplugs, and which were particularly to use for on the road, but they can use them at home as well.
Mm.
So I think yeah, I actually forget what your actual question was, but I digress. But yes, it's really important to actually give that athlete the education piece and know how to or try and at least create that behavior change in the athlete.
Yep, that was spot on. It was all about exactly that, like lifestyle changes and how to educate athletes, the importance of sleep and nutrition, like you mentioned. And I like that aspect of influencing the environment and setting it up for them to, I guess if you're they don't have to think that's taking stress out of the athlete, which is another way that you can help them recover with less
Yeah.
decisions to make. So that's a good one. I like that. And in terms of the presentations, how making them engaging, I think that would be a helpful, quick little thing to touch on. But you mentioned photos and things that that would engage the audience that you're talking to. Would talk us through what that would look like? And you mentioned they're short and snappy, but how many slides? How would you? What's your mindset going into it in terms of making an engagement, and how would you manage the sort of group when you're going those presentations to make it engaging, but also for them to have some key actionables?
Yeah, so get rid of the writing. They're not going to read anything. You can have one number on there or maybe one word, and then just talk to the slide, but also images. So, images, illustrations. So, how can you sum your point in a picture? Because I'm not going to say all of them, but a lot of them will learn visually. And So trying to, obviously we can't do anything kinesthetic, and they're going to be listening to me anyway. So I've got to try and hit as many points as I can without using writing. The other one is players love to look at videos of themselves. They absolutely love it, and they love to look at photos of themselves. So actually getting footage of them, in the gym or getting food or something, and then playing that, because the boys will listen, they'll have a good laugh, and then you've got their attention. So I think like trying to use familiar photos, but then also photos of themselves. Um, I think you always get a positive response from I guess the players like getting around each other, let's just say. So whatever you can do to stimulate that, sort of
Mhm.
that cohesion point of view, and then you'll find you have their engagement a lot more afterwards.
Yeah. And from a performance point of view, you mentioned the importance of building the training squad up to, majority of the squad trying to get that close to that 80% completion of preseason. Do you have other performance metrics when you're going into a preseason that you're keen on the group achieving over a preseason to set them up for a successful season?
So I think, are you talking mainly just on pitch and training variables, or?
Yeah, yeah. Training variables, it doesn't have to be necessarily soccer specific. It can be um, any sport, but yeah, metrics I guess that you're um, focusing on, hitting and targets.
Yeah. So I think looking at, depending on your sport, looking at, you can look at the amount of time or maybe the amount of load, again using uh, duration times RPE, that you're spending in each element of your training. So let's just say rugby union, for example, we actually looked at the percentage of time or the amount of load that we were getting, say, from a contact conditioning session in a week versus a lifting session versus an on-pitch rugby session. And
Mm.
we wanted at the start of preseason, say, some areas to have a lot more amount of the load coming from there rather than from, say, a lifting session or whichever it might be. So for me anyway, obviously, soccer players don't like to lift that much. So I brought in a good couple of weeks of strength where we didn't have that much pitch work, because they're always looking to save legs. And I said, well, we're actually not on the pitch that much these couple of weeks. So we're actually going to go pretty heavy in the gym. And then later down the line in preseason still, where again we dropped that volume, we actually upped the gym work again as well. So I think it's obviously understanding what the demands of your sport are, and then how much time are you dedicating to each one, or how much load are you getting from each one. But of course, like variable specific, you're always looking at the sport that you're actually working in. Yeah, if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. If a club's not tracking RPE, would you just simply look at the schedule of the week and just break up time allocated to certain sections like craft, meetings, so tactical, uh, then your main training sessions, the technical, and then like you break that down, like you mentioned with contact for rugby, and then gym. If you've got hour rotations, that's 60 minutes dedicated to gym. Is that how you'd sort of cover that if there isn't any session RPE, or is there a better way to go about it?
So that's something I have done before, where I've just actually looked at duration. So
Yep.
even within the session, looking at how much time is dedicated to, because I think that's important, because again, you could have a 3 hour long session where you haven't actually done that much load from like an RPE times duration perspective, but also from like a GPS variable perspective. But there's still 3 hours, and that could have been 2.5 hours spent on tactical. So then at the end of the week, let's just say if tactical was the focus, that's absolutely fine. You can show that, okay, 80% of the time this week we spent on tactical. However, if building physical capacities and being physically robust and being faster and fitter or something was the focus of that week, and you can show the coach, well, actually we spent 80% of the week or more on tactical variables, like how we can't, let's just say we can't get fitter if that's where we're spending our time. So
Yeah.
it's definitely something that I've used before, to illustrate that point anyway. I'm not saying it's the best way to do it, and I'm not saying it's the only way to do it, but it is an easy way to do it, because you're always going to have the GPS data, and the sports scientists should always split that between the drills, and it's very easy to separate out what's tactical and what's technical and what's so on and so forth. So if you ever need to get a point across, that could be one way to do it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you for sharing that. And how did it go down with the coach? They responded well. You got your minutes.
Well, look, it's always a slow burn, and somehow you need to turn it into their idea first, and they'll typically come to you a week later and be like, "Look, I've had a thought," and that's when they repeat your idea back to you, and you go, "Oh, that's a really good idea. We should definitely do that." So it's typically how it goes, and there's no insults to coaches out there, but I just found that that's usually the best way to do it.
Yep, yep. And to go back to the recovery aspect of things for the athletes listening in, like what would be your recommendation for someone that perhaps has dabbled with an ice bath here and there, sauna, maybe they've had a sports massage, but they haven't really found their routine that suits them yet. Where do you sit on things like active recovery, yoga, mindfulness? Um, and then we've talked about, I guess, the importance of nutrition and sleep, but just more, I guess, the passive and active recovery for the physical side.
Yeah, sure. So obviously considering all those other aspects first, like what stress do you actually have imposed on you? Not just,
Hmm.
oh, I ran a marathon yesterday. Did you take a flight in the morning, cross three time zones, then run a marathon, and then take the flight back? Because you need to consider that element as well. Like, okay, well, I sat on a plane for 6 hours or however many hours. Um, but so one thing I did, which I've done a lot before and still doing now, but was particularly useful in basketball, was actually using training load game variables to then prescribe recovery. And of course, factoring in all those layers of the additional stress on the athlete. And, number one always being how can we actually just get them to sleep a little bit more? Where can we put in a nap today and so on? But I've split it up, into assumed mechanical damage and assumed physiological damage, let's call, or stress, or metabolic, sometimes people call it. So if you think of more of your intensive variables, such as your hard accels, hard decels, sorry, your sprint distance, sometimes number of sprints, they're typically the ones that contribute to more mechanical damage. So you're looking at more eccentric muscle actions. So with that, we obviously had an outstanding team there. We had a couple of chefs that we'd work really closely with, and so they were actually part of our department. And I was the conduit between our department and these chefs to ensure that what they were getting aligned with what we wanted them to get. So you could again assume with mechanical damage that there's a lot of inflammation and so on. So we're looking at repairing that tissue as quickly as possible. So you might put in some fatty fish that day into the lunch. So you're looking at those omega-3s and so on. And then also looking at collagen supplementation. But then also from a passive recovery modality, you definitely look at more your cold strategies. So your cold water immersion. So looking at, I think 12 degrees is now the more commonly used temperature, and most has the most beneficial effects. So minimum of 12 minutes in there, 12 to 15 minutes, and then potentially some massage as well could also be helpful. But then if you look at your demands from the game, and they're a little bit more extensive, so you're looking at your more physiologically demanding games. So there are a few ways to look at this. Again, it depends on your sport. I've seen quite a few ways to measure this, but you can assume that there's glycogen depletion, there's acidosis, and so on. So from that perspective, you're actually looking at like replenishing glycogen. If there's
Hmm.
not too much damage, then you're potentially using some hot water immersion, or potentially on the safer side, you'd probably go for more cold water immersion. And then you're also looking at, say, tart cherry juice supplementation. In a sense, you get the polyphenols, but then you also get the carbohydrates as well from that. So that's how we did it a lot at the 76ers, because it really is play, recover, play, recover, play, recover. And
Mm.
yes, you can just throw spaghetti at the wall and hope something sticks, of course, and sometimes you are throwing the kitchen sink at the players, because the reality is they have to be ready to perform 48 hours later, sometimes less. So, but my idea was, well, how could we be more targeted with this rather than just saying
Mm.
do everything, saying, well, what's the best thing we could potentially do? And then you can actually also prescribe top ups on that as well. So this is something I do quite commonly now, is where, so say rugby, let's take rugby for an example. Let's just say you looked at impacts or collisions, versus some sort of running metric that you're interested in. And so I just built like just a very basic quadrant and see where each player sat, on an absolute level, and then also from, let's just using a basic Z score from where they usually sit following a game. And so if they're up in the right-hand corner, you can assume high running loads and high contacts. So you're probably looking at a lot more of your, like cold modalities, your nutritional interventions, and so on. Whereas if they were low running load but high contacts, you still want them to do a bit of cold water immersion and potentially do something to attenuate that eccentric damage. But you then probably want to supplement those running loads. So that's where you can start to prescribe your top ups. So, okay, well, you're doing top ups today. It's going to be this many minutes, and we're going to do these drills and so on. So whether that's from a, I mean, I always way prefer to do the sport specific top ups rather than just purely run conditioning. So let's just say in the context now, we're looking at small sided games with then a couple of maybe like 60-meter builds just to get some high velocities in there as well. But then also, you know, you could find, so say, talking about rugby again, where you find an athlete has had low contacts but a high running load, you might actually want to do some contact conditioning with them. But then you're also looking at supplementing, you know, glycogen restoration and so on, because they have had those high running loads. So I think you're not always just looking at recovery. Depending on your sport, you might actually be looking at, okay, well, where can we top these guys up? And I mean, so they've had an intensive game, you might need extensive variables, and then vice versa as well.
Yeah. And how do you go if it's not in the culture yet where top ups have been done? How did you go about selling that to the athlete or even the coaches if they had apprehension with it, with getting them to do sprints and even contact? I imagine if it's the first time them doing it after a game, there'd be some some challenging conversations potentially between the athletes. How did you go with that?
I think that's my answer is always the same when someone asks something like this. It's a slow burn. So
Yeah.
I think there's always an element of building rapport and building trust, whether that's with the athlete or the coach. And that always happens in the initial stages. And that's probably what I was talking about before when I was saying that you observe a lot and you ask people a lot. And so there's always that element there of building the rapport. So when they know that you have their best interests at heart, they're a lot more likely to be receptive to your ideas. So we did finally get post-game top-ups at the 76ers, which was quite foreign when we got there. I think in other sports, you have more of the luxury, well, the other sports I've worked in, let's say, you have the luxury of having 4, 5, 6, 7 days in between games. So you typically do that on the following day. Because then you can be more effective and a little bit more targeted, because especially, well, even in basketball as well, actually, we wouldn't get the data until about 4 in the morning. And look, I will just say as well, yes, the data we're getting in basketball is not very reliable. It's all based on second spectrum and time motion analysis, and that wasn't congruent with the system that we had back at the facility. So it was comparing apples and oranges, but it was the best that we had. So comparing that with obviously just a conversation on how the athlete felt. So I think there was always this element of players that didn't play much. They loved being on court and they wanted to train. So then the next day, they would come in. So if a player played more than, say, 30 odd minutes, they wouldn't come in the next day. Whereas if they played less than that, they would come in and they'd work with their individual coach, or they'd do what we call a low minute game, which is just essentially a small sided game. And so then we can have that conversation with the coaches and say, okay, well, they had a lot of this last night, so let's just keep it a half court stuff today. Or they actually need a lot of full court transition type work, so let's do full court work and then bring it back to this. Or is there a drill that we could do where they have to run up and down the court, shoot, do this, and we're looking at, say, 90-second periods with 60 seconds rest, or however you'd manage it. So you'd really work with the coaches based on that top ups. So I'd say the next day stuff became a little bit more important, because then you can be a little bit more prescriptive. Plus, we're at our facility, plus they can have all the recovery modalities, passive or active, available to them, including the nutritional interventions and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. Like you mentioned, how each setting can have its own nuance, and how to work your way towards putting in these processes, and working with everyone that's involved, coaches and athletes. It's great. Thank you so much for sharing. You mentioned I think it was Excel Sports, or back early days, where you're doing your own learning and practicing your skills. What's your favorite way to sharpen your craft these days? Have you got a or recommendation for sport scientists out there that you methods to improve your craft?
Yeah, there's so many these days. Like, you barely even need to go to uni anymore. So so Twitter has always been number one for me. I just think if you're a sports scientist and you want to keep your finger on the pulse, you've got to be on Twitter and just follow the right people, and they'll follow the right people, and basically you'll just constantly see new publications pop up. People post great stuff, and it's incredible that they're giving it away for free. So Twitter's a really, really good one. Yeah, look, definitely moved on from Excel and use Python these days. So I'm actually doing a course through MIT X, which is just MIT's online learning system, and it's something like using Python for machine learning and deep learning or something. And but that's obviously a little bit more oriented towards my PhD. But there are so many online courses now that are free. If you want to pay for the certificate, you can. So I did one through Stanford called Writing in the Sciences back in my first year of my PhD, and that was probably one of the most valuable courses I ever did. And that just completely reframed my idea of how to write a publication. So there's so many courses, and you just Google them and you'll find them, or people will post them on Twitter. And then, of course, just going through PubMed or Google Scholar. But also there's just so many good practitioners out there that create their own courses. So I recently did Martin Buscheidt's and Paul Larson's Science of Application of High Intensity Interval Training, which was incredible, and just obviously like something I'm really interested in. And then I'm just finishing Matt Jordan's his second course. So it's called Jordan Strength. So that's a really good one that he's got there. So basically helping somewhat strength diagnostics using force plates and so on. But there's just so many avenues these days, and there's just so many ways to learn. Like, once, I think you have to, like, your uni degree is your ticket to the game, but then to stay in the game and keep playing competitively, you need to continually upskill and keep progressing yourself, not just for your current job, but for what level of skill you want to have and then bring to your next job and so on. So
yeah, you clearly do a good job of functioning at a high level and managing many different things at once. What would be your tip from a productivity point of view? Is it get up early and get your work done early? What do you find you've done over the years to maintain constantly learning, but then working in elite sport?
So for me, like, if I've the whole own the morning or in the day, but if I find that I've had a productive morning, I'm a lot more likely to be productive for the rest of the day. But I think for any individual, it's about finding which time during the day are they most like highest functioning. Because for me, once it hits about 3 or 4 o'clock, I'm just like dead. There's no point. Like, something will just go in one ear and out the other. So I know that my like optimal hours of the day to learn and to work are definitely from, say, 6 a.m. till about 3 or 4 p.m. So that's when I'm definitely highest functioning. I'll be completely useless in the evening. So I'd say try and find what time works for you. Because for some people it might be getting up at 5 in the morning and trying to get 2 hours in before the kids wake up. But for others it might be, staying up until midnight and getting 2 hours in after the kids have gone to bed. So also context specific as well. But for me, yeah, it was just really that morning piece. So getting my work done then.
Yeah, yeah. And before we wrap it up, Carmen, is there anything that you'd like to mention on the topic of training load and prescribing recovery?
Yeah, I think the other one would be just understand the individual. So
Mm-hmm.
I think gone are the days where we used to just give blanket recommendations for the athletes. So say everyone, okay, you've all played last night. Now everyone's got to get in the ice baths. So of course, what I was talking about before, looking at the specific variables, so what actually happened in the game, but then also understanding what does the athlete like or not like, because
Mm-hmm.
if an athlete hates the ice bath and they get in there and they just like almost go sympathetic rather than parasympathetic, which is essentially any time you're trying to get the athlete to recover, you're trying to get them to shift more over to their parasympathetic state, which as an athlete, you spend so much time in your sympathetic state. So you have to activate your rest and digest system. So if they get into the ice bath and they go more sympathetic, that could have an opposing effect. So it's actually about getting to know what the athlete actually likes. And it could be the same with giving them a protein shake or tart cherry juice. They could absolutely hate it, or they don't like the flavor, or they don't like to eat after games, or so on. So it's really about working with the individual and understanding that what are their characteristics, what are their likes, dislikes, preferences, and so on. So get to know the athlete. So
Mm.
so important, and then prescribe based on that individual there, and then as well as the context.
Yeah, yeah, love that. It's a great way to wrap it up. Um, to get onto more the personal side, do you have pet peeves? Anything in your life that, or your professional life that fires you up?
Oh, one thing I always say is how you do anything is how you do everything, and I think that applies to everyone in your personal and professional life. But so say
Mhm.
in the performance context, you see lazy athletes in the gym, or lazy athletes in training, you're going to see that transpire on the field as well. So if there's a way you can potentially have that conversation with the athlete or correct laziness or address laziness, let's just say in the gym, um, you can potentially help that laziness where they probably don't quite get to the position they need to be in, on the pitch, something during the game. But that's just one example. I think there'd be a myriad of examples I'm sure you could even think of where you've seen certain things that someone does transpire in other elements of their life as well. So how you do anything is how you do everything.
Yeah, love that. And what about what's your favorite way to spend your day off?
Well, we were chatting offline before, so I am 6 months pregnant. So at the moment, things are just feeling a little bit challenging. So I'm not as, say, active as I used to be. But obviously, I have a dog and a fiance. So just like to go out and take the dog for a walk. We live 200 meters from the beach. So a lot of beach time. And yeah, at the moment, it's just a lot of resting and letting my body recover a little bit from work when I do happen to have a day off. So unfortunately, nothing very exciting there.
Oh, very exciting. Well, that probably it's a good segue to the next question and my final question. What are you excited for 2023? I can probably get your answer. You probably just mentioned or
Yeah,
alluded to it there, but a few things in the pipeline. I guess
yeah.
one
Obviously,
personal
expect.
and one professional.
Yeah, so expecting first child in June, which is very exciting. And then also professionally, yeah, we've done really well. So Perth Glory, where I think we're currently sitting seventh. So last season they came dead last, and had a lot of injuries. And this season we're now sitting seventh. And of course, I understand everything can change very quickly. But so far, I feel like we're progressing well. We're fit, we're fast, and we're strong. Um, so I would really, really like to see us make finals and hopefully get some silverware or something. Let's see.
Yeah, yeah. Fingers crossed. Well, they're in good hands.
Yeah,
So they're a lucky squad, and and great work. And thank you so much for jumping on, Carmen. I really appreciate your time and sharing with us your experiences and across multiple codes, but also around the world. I really appreciate it, especially on behalf of all the sports science and initiating coaches and those working in high performance sport, but also aspire to. I think you provide a massive amount of value over the last hour, so I really appreciate it. For those that want to get in contact, is there a social media person? You mentioned Twitter. Is there a best place to get in contact, maybe for a follow-up question for someone that listening into the podcast?
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind words, firstly, but Twitter is definitely the best place. I've had a lot of people add me on Instagram lately, and it's just nothing sport related, and it's very boring. I'm very boring on Instagram, so Twitter is the place. It's Carmen Colomer 1, and
Yep.
I'm not very good at it, but I try and post stuff every now and then, probably a little bit more relevant to my PhD, so a lot more complex systems analysis type stuff and more influencing tactical stuff rather than, say, physical variables, let's say. So if you're interested
Mhm.
in that, maybe you'd get a bit out of following me. So
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll add the your handle on the show notes. So for anyone listening into the podcast recording, perhaps driving, that's how I like to listen to my podcast episodes. Don't stress, you don't need to check the phone. It'll be nice and easy. You can click the link in the show notes. Yeah, thank you again, Carmen. Thank you for everyone that's tuned in. If you tuned in halfway through, this will sit live on our YouTube channel. So before we publish it on a podcast in the next couple of weeks, you can watch the whole interview on YouTube. And our next interview is with Billy Hewlin, who is another sports scientist, actually. He's just recently joined the Collingwood Football Club. So looking forward to catching up with Billy. That's next Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Australian Eastern Time. So I'll see you guys then.